Chapter 7. On Persistence and the Anti-Fragility of Failure. Gutta cavat lapidem, non sic sed seep cadendo. The drop of rain maketh a hole in the stone, not by violence, but by oft falling. Hugh Latimer. No tree which the wind does not often blow against is firm and strong, for it is stiffened by the very act of being shaken, and plants its roots more securely. Those which grow in a sheltered valley are brittle, and so it is to the advantage of good men, and causes them to be undismayed, that they should live much amidst alarms, and learn to bear with patience what is not evil, save to him who endures it ill. Seneca. Success in life requires persistence and grit. Of course, one of the reasons that people do not persist is that they get smashed by rejection. Rejection in the mating market, rejection as a starving musical band, rejection from publishers, rejection during the peer review process, rejection when applying for jobs. Rejection is clearly an unhappy experience. That said, as long as rejection does not kill you, it will indeed make you stronger if you have the will to persist. Enduring failure and coming back and persisting in your efforts is how you become anti-fragile. You might think of wolves, lions, and tigers as some of the world's leading predators among land mammals. Their hunting skills have been honed by millions of years of evolution. Yet it might surprise you to know that their kill rates are 14% for wolves, 25% for lions, and 5% for tigers. Even the great white shark has only a 48% success rate when it comes to attacks on seals. Not only is the predator-prey dynamic replete with failures, as we might expect, given that prey animals have evolved strategies of evasion, but failures define many intraspecies dynamics. Many courtship rituals across a broad range of species involve competition, typically between male suitors for a female. Failure is inevitable, especially for younger, smaller, less experienced males. But dogged persistence can also be rewarded. As these animals grow and adapt their fighting or courtship strategies, the ability to overcome adversity and failure is an evolved capacity that is essential to countless organisms, including humans. The capacity to develop an anti-fragile response to repeated failures is a fundamental, necessary, and beneficial feature of life. No meaningful goal can ever be achieved without resilience and effort. The power of anti-fragility. In countless different settings in nature, stressors are at times necessary for optimal functioning. If you are a wine aficionado, you probably know that the best wines grow in harsh environments. In the words of Jeff Cox, a wine expert, the best wines are made from vines that have to struggle. Staying within the botanical realm, trees benefit greatly from dealing with the stresses imposed by nature. Trees that were planted in the closed ecosystem of Biosphere 2 grew quickly, but did not fully mature. It turned out that the lack of stressors, most especially the lack of wind, actually impeded the growth of the trees. When trees are exposed to wind and thus allowed to sway, they grow stronger and develop larger trunks, among other properties. This is part of the field known as seismomorphogenesis, namely the study of how movement affects plants' development and growth. This knowledge has been incorporated within the design of buildings, where there is great seismological activity, like earthquakes. Buildings are now built with the capacity to sway, and to have safeguards against becoming structurally brittle. So too, do children need to be exposed to certain environmental stressors to learn adaptability and thrive, including stressors that strengthen their immune system. Children who grow up in allergen-poor environments are more likely to develop respiratory maladies precisely because their immune systems were not appropriately and adequately stressed when they were younger. An allergen-free, sterile environment is actually detrimental to one's health. In my book, The Parasitic Mind, I discussed how this could be analogized to ideological echo chambers. Intellectual environments that do not contain a diversity of opinions yield suboptimal critical thinking, as human minds expect to be challenged. Whether referring to wine, trees, human lungs, or human minds, among countless other biological systems, we benefit from being anti-fragile. People can never be maximally happy if they navigate through life with a brittle, fragile personality or mindset, as progressives so often do. In May 2022, I delivered 2 lectures at the Salem Center for Policy, housed at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. During the Q&A period following my lecture on the parasitic mind, a young man asked me, "You have been through actual difficulty in your life, and yet you've chosen to not identify as a victim. And you've maintained a very high level of personal power, seemingly throughout that. So my question is, 1. What do you think is the reason that you've continued to maintain that power, even through those difficulties? And for when people are going through actual difficult experiences, whether social justice topics or just generally in life, what advice would you have for people to maintain great personal power through that?" My response fully captures the anti-fragility mindset. The adversity that I faced made me more desirous to succeed. So, for example, I even grew up with some difficulties in my nuclear family, where for many years after we moved from Lebanon to Montreal, my parents were absent. They had returned to Lebanon. Actually, in 1980, they were kidnapped by Fatah, and I talk about this briefly in Chapter 1 of The Parasitic Mind. And so, many of these episodes, that many of you may not have even heard of, could have sent me straight into wallowing in victimology for the rest of my life. My unique combination of genes made it that I had this thing of, I'm going to shove it up everybody's ass, if you forgive the colloquialism. I'm going to succeed. We grow by going through anti-fragility, right? That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Those sayings exist precisely because, through anti-fragile mechanisms, it makes me stronger as long as it doesn't kill me. So, there is no magic recipe. Look, I'm going to be very personal here regarding last week, when I found out that the Quebec and Canadian government were going to literally steal more than 50% of my neuronal firings, my book Royalties of the Parasitic Mind. I went into a deep depressive existential crisis. I was wondering if I would have the moxie to come to give this talk here. I'm still desperate about it, but guess what? I'm going to shove it up their ass. And so you know, there's no exact magic recipe. But hopefully by me saying this, it empowers others. And so on goes the circle. My response received raucous applause from the audience. Life can be tough, but adversity can drive us to succeed. And that very effort can make us happy. That is my own attitude, and this winning mindset has served me well. A mindset of victimhood breeds misery. Be resilient. In The Parasitic Mind, I discuss the psychological and societal processes that have made victimology poker the game of choice among Western progressives. The key currency of success is to possess the most compelling victimhood narrative, which can be ensured via the dual processes of collective Munchausen, the manufacture of faux victimhood, and the homeostases of victimology. Redefine innocuous and banal transgressions as acts of bigotry, violence, racism, Islamophobia, or transphobia, or innumerable other alleged phobias, so as to maintain a pre-established narrative regarding the evils of Western societies. When Oprah was told by a sales clerk in Switzerland that she could not afford a 38-0 handbag, this became her defining moment of victimhood. Sure, she makes more money than entire countries, but she is shackled by white supremacy, and the unfortunate fact that a sales clerk in Switzerland failed to recognize her for the superstar that she is was obviously a hateful act of oppression. Move aside, Nelson Mandela. Stop whining, Yazidi women. The gang rapes that you faced at the hands of sadistic ISIS fighters are nothing compared to the daily genocide that LeBron James must avoid when driving from Beverly Hills to the Staples Center for his basketball practice. He is a true victim. Dear Iger whiners, could you please stop complaining about your seizure in the concentration camps, kindly organized for your re-education by the noble Chinese government? When Oprah held a chat with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, they confirmed that they are true victims. You see, Meghan said she had been told that her son would not be made a prince when Prince Charles ascended to the throne. The obvious reason, she said, was that of course the royal family is racist. Even though the awarding of titles is governed by set rules, and Prince Charles, now King Charles III, had long been trying to limit the number of royals. Contrary facts can never displace a victimhood narrative. The courage that Oprah, Meghan Markle, and Prince Harry exhibit as entitled and pampered millionaires in the United States is exemplary. Only a fellow victim-like woman of color, Senator Elizabeth Warren, could understand the full horrors of their plight. As I stated in The Parasitic Mind, the defining ethos is I am a victim, therefore I am. The ethos of victimology is not restricted to individuals, but can become the defining feature of an entire people world. History is replete with endless, tragic stories of conquest, murder, pillage, occupation, and renewal. History is forged by endless rivers of bloodshed and mayhem. My wife is Lebanese-Armenian. Her ancestors fled the 1915 through 1917 genocide at the hands of the Ottomans. The birth of her parents in Lebanon stemmed from that original exodus. Of course, my wife's immediate family had to subsequently flee Lebanon in 1979 due to the brutal civil war there, and they settled in Canada. Between 1939 and 1945, 6 million Jews were systematically exterminated by the Nazis. And yet, by 1948, the modern state of Israel was founded, and has since flourished as an oasis of economic vitality and political freedom in a neighborhood of brutality and repression. Some of my readers and listeners might remember the horrors that my family faced during the Lebanese Civil War. There are no monopolies on narratives of genuine victimhood. There are no monopolies on human suffering. Armenians and Jews are quite similar in that they always constitute small minorities in their respective diasporas, yet they nonetheless end up overachieving. There are no magical recipes to explain this success other than a commitment to not wallow in their truly horrible stories of victimhood. They recognize their tragic histories of suffering. They remember the past, but they always look forward with optimism, pride, and personal agency. Not all peoples possess those coping mechanisms. Instead, they prefer to swim in a bottomless pool of resentment, grievance, and misery. Many of the idea pathogens that I covered in The Parasitic Mind are rooted in the politics of perpetual grievance, which is especially galling since those proclaiming to be victims are oftentimes minorities whose victimhood lies well in the past. In some cases, centuries ago, successful conservative black Americans like Candace Owens, Larry Elder, and Thomas Sowell are despised by leftist self-proclaimed leaders of the greater African American community precisely because these conservative stalwarts preach a message that rejects victimhood, that upholds the idea of personal agency, that recognizes the positives of living in a Western, democratic, capitalist land of opportunity like America. Happy people look to succeed in the business of life, rather than flounder in a never-ending game of victimology poker. If you were to visit a therapist to work through some childhood trauma, it is unlikely that the clinician would require you, or advise you, to be defined by those tragic moments. Instead, she would seek pathways to help you overcome the trauma and pursue a life of enrichment and happiness. While personal negative experiences need to be dealt with, no mental health professional will suggest that you wallow in a state of perpetual victimhood. And yet, this is exactly what the so-called progressive Western intelligentsia peddle to various identity groups. They tell them to shackle themselves to perpetual victimhood. They claim that only victimhood can bring them liberation. Progressives are like orchestra conductors, waving a baton so that every self-shackled identity group can whine on cue. Such orchestrated whining of any kind, can never bring happiness. I offer a different message. Recognize that your past, which might include tragic elements, is a feature of your personhood. But you are not defined by past injustices. Rather, you should be invigorated by the promises of a better future. The only road to individual dignity and sustained existential happiness is to adopt an ethos of personal agency. You are the ultimate architect of your own happiness. So get to work. Be resilient in the face of rejections. Many years ago, my brother, an Olympian judoka, and I were hanging out at a nightclub in Southern California. While we are both extroverted characters, he has always been rather flamboyant in his social style. True to form, while standing around the dance floor, he turned to me and asked me to pinpoint the prettiest and most unattainable woman in the club. At first, I was hesitant to do so, because I was reluctant to partake in some of his over-the-top antics. After his repeated insistence that I comply, I began to look around the dance floor for the most beautiful woman, who was hopefully accompanied by an ominous-looking boyfriend, hence rendering her even more unattainable. I zeroed in on a woman who was indeed very beautiful and dancing very intimately with her male partner. After my brother had confirmed with me that this was my final choice, he proceeded to the periphery of the dance floor and waited for the right opportunity to approach her. It took less than a few minutes for the intimidating-looking boyfriend to head off to the bathroom, at which point my brother approached the woman. My brother is short of stature, so the somewhat tall woman, who was wearing high heels, was towering over him. This was of no concern to my brother, who chatted with her for a minute or two, and then returned to me and said, "She'll call me tomorrow." To which I retorted an incredulous, "No way." The next day, my brother summoned me to the answering machine. Yes, this story is from many years ago, and said, "Listen," he played a message, which, to my amazement, was from the beautiful woman from the previous night. She was essentially asking for a date. How was he able to pull off this nearly impossible feat of getting a beautiful woman with an apparently serious boyfriend to take an interest in him? Well, there were two fundamental reasons for his success. First, he approached the woman with overflowing confidence. Women are very attracted to confident men, hence that which he may have lacked in terms of height, he made up for with self-assuredness. Second, he was utterly oblivious to the otherwise stifling fear of possible rejection. It is never easy to be rejected. But if one is truly able to demystify the negative emotions associated with ephemeral rejections, endless new opportunities appear. It is perhaps not surprising that early in his career, my brother was a very successful salesman in the software industry. An inherent reality in sales is the dreaded string of rejections that one is likely to face until a deal is finally signed. High-end sales constitutes an interminable sequence of no thank you, followed by an eventual lucrative yes. When men approach women for romantic purposes, the rejection rates are astoundingly high. In a classic study that examined the likelihood of a man or woman meeting a stranger and accepting an offer to have sex, many men accepted the invitation, as high as 75%, whereas not one woman did so. Since the costs of making a bad mating choice are much graver for women, they are much more careful in the mating arena. For men, rejection is a central feature of the human courtship ritual. In many species, the courtship ritual involves a built-in test of persistence. This test is typically applied to males, and mating persistence is thus a sexually selected trait. This is not, however, an invitation to sexual harassment, but it also helps explain why it is common in human cultures for men to have to win a mate by proving their courage, wealth, intelligence, and other qualities. Competition is part of life, and with competition comes the constant reality that one might be rejected or defeated. Jia Zhang is a man on a mission. He wants to demystify the paralyzing fear of rejection that most people suffer from. He created a blog titled 100 Days of Rejection Therapy, wherein he challenged himself to complete 100 tasks laden with rejection potential. Walking up to a stranger and asking if he could borrow 100. Knocking on someone's door and asking if he could plant a flower in his backyard. Asking to be a greeter at Starbucks. In a manner similar to how exposure therapy is used in clinical settings to overcome debilitating phobias, Zhang learned that we can attenuate the potentially crippling fear of rejection by forcing ourselves to deal with the repeated possibility of rejection. He also learned strategies to overcome rejection. As the old saying goes, experience can be a great teacher. Stories of rejection are at the root of nearly every uplifting story of stratospheric excellence, be it in sports, the literary world, music, or filmmaking. Zinedine Zidane is one of the greatest soccer players of all time. He was largely responsible for France's lifting of its first World Cup trophy in 1998. He could have represented Algeria in terms of his national team by ancestry, but the coach of the Algerian national team thought that he was too slow, and accordingly rejected him. Zidane was also rejected by Marseille, his boyhood club. Lionel Messi, the Argentine soccer player whom many experts consider the greatest soccer player of all time, was considered too small to succeed professionally, even by his eventual club FC Barcelona, with whom he eventually broke every conceivable club record. Michael Jordan, arguably the greatest basketball player of all time, was cut from his high school team during his sophomore year. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter franchise of 7 books has sold more than 500 million copies, making it the all-time leading book series. The first book of the series had been rejected by 12 publishers before Bloomsbury Publishing agreed to publish it. The publisher's then 8-year-old daughter had read the submitted manuscript and loved it, which served as the impetus for Rowling receiving the contract. She received a paltry 500 as an advance, and 500 copies were originally printed. At the time, Rowling was an unemployed, financially destitute, depressed single mother living on welfare. She admitted to having contemplated suicide, and yet her persistence, self-belief, and the magic of happenstance via the publisher's young daughter have altered the literary and cinematic landscape forevermore. The Harry Potter series is one of innumerable astoundingly successful literary works that were originally, repeatedly rejected. There is a website that keeps track of some of the most successful books of all time, along with a count of the original number of rejections that their authors received. These include Chicken Soup for the Soul, 144 rejections, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, 121 rejections, Lord of the Flies, 21 rejections, and Dr. Seuss's And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, 27 rejections, among many other literary classics. The Beatles, who are among the most successful musical acts of all time, were repeatedly rejected by music labels until they were eventually signed by George Martin. Steven Spielberg was rejected, not once, not twice, but 3 times from the USC Film School. And he went on to become one of the greatest film directors of all time, winning 3 Academy Awards. Imagine if these exceptional individuals had allowed a string of rejections to defeat them. The world would be a much poorer place. While persistence is a central feature of eventual success, persistence as a positive trait follows the logic of the inverted U-curve. There comes a time when repeated failure is itself a lesson to do something else. If you are not in the least bit persistent, you will never achieve important goals in your life. But if you are inflexibly persistent, you might fail to walk away from a losing proposition and miss better opportunities. The capacity to walk away from unreachable goals is a crucial adaptive response for achieving optimal well-being and health, including reducing psychological and physical distress. Academia, long string of rejections peppered with occasional successes. When I was applying to doctoral programs, I thought with complete self-assuredness that I would be accepted everywhere. After all, I had a stellar application dossier, including rigorous degrees, BSc in mathematics and computer science, and an MBA from a leading university, McGill. Top grades, very high scores on the standardized GMAT test, extensive experience as a research assistant, and strong letters of recommendation. I had to swallow a full serving of humble pie when the rejection started to trickle in. Eventually, though, I was accepted at several world-leading institutions and ended up enrolling at Cornell University, one of my top 2 choices. But the rejection letters served as a preparatory omen for the endless sequence of rejections to come throughout my academic career. I truly excelled in my doctoral studies at Cornell, so much so that the department's faculty chose me as their 1993 Doctoral Consortium Fellow. Top doctoral student, the year that I was going out on the academic job market. I was working on a very rigorous and exciting dissertation topic: the cognitive strategies that people use when deciding to stop acquiring additional information on 2 competing alternatives and commit to a winning choice. And I was supervised by a world-renowned and highly respected psychologist in the field. I was considered one of the top candidates on the market that year, and was offered many first-round interviews with leading universities. I believe that it was around 25 interviews. In the second round, 5 of the universities, including Harvard Business School, invited me for campus visits, each of which required that I present my doctoral dissertation work to the respective departments. Rumor had it that I had come close to landing the coveted Harvard position, but regrettably, I was ultimately rejected. According to the grapevine, in part for reasons that had little to do with my dossier. This was a very disappointing outcome. But I did end up being offered an assistant professorship in my home city of Montreal. A second offer was forthcoming, but there was a deadline to accept the standing offer, so I accepted it prior to hearing from the other university. Several of my Cornell doctoral cohorts, most of whom were outstanding candidates, were unable to land assistant professorships, and they accordingly left academia and my field at that time. To land an academic job required that you obtain your doctorate from one of a few elite universities, with very low acceptance rates into their doctoral programs. Be amongst the elite of your doctoral cohort, incredibly competitive given the talent pool, whilst navigating through an endless sequence of heartbreaking rejections. One cannot navigate through such statistical realities without an anti-fragility mindset. Today, of course, universities do not even pretend to be interested in the ethos of meritocracy. Instead, they deploy DIE principles, diversity, inclusion, and equity to choose candidates based on immutable traits and other irrelevant factors that have nothing to do with intellectual or scholarly merit. Skin color, ethnic origin, and gender identity are at least as important as a candidate's talent in today's academic zeitgeist. In my day, albeit this holds true today, once you had started out and landed the very rare and coveted academic position, the rejection rates only intensified moving forward. Grant applications to fund one's research were highly competitive, and it remains very difficult to land some of the more prestigious scientific grants. Once you secured the necessary funds to conduct your research, you then faced arguably the most daunting abyss of rejection: the prestigious academic journals, many of which have astonishingly high rejection rates. Nature has a 92% rejection rate, whereas the New England Journal of Medicine publishes only 5% of the research papers submitted to it. Leading journals in psychology are also very competitive to crack. Data from 2017 lists the Journal of Applied Psychology, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and Psychological Review as having rejection rates of 90%, 87%, and 86% respectively. The psychology journal with the highest rejection rate was the Journal of Consumer Psychology at 91%. I am proud to have published 5 papers in that particular journal, my last paper of which involved the greatest number of rounds of revisions that I have ever faced prior to its being accepted. It was truly an exercise in grit, determination, persistence, and unwavering discipline. A typical academic paper might take between 1 and 3 years, from the conception of an idea to submitting it to a journal. It must then go through multiple rounds of peer review, and most papers will ultimately be rejected. Of course, when such a rejection occurs, the authors can then resubmit it elsewhere, and the process starts all over again. I have supervised many bright and talented graduate students. One day, I met with one such student to discuss why there were delays in running our studies. I suspected he had succumbed to the fear of epistemological rejection. That is, he was worried that if we conducted the studies, the beautiful hypotheses might be rejected. He was honest enough to admit that my hunch was correct. I sought to assuage his fears by explaining to him that most worthy pursuits in life, including in science, are risky. We cannot continuously hide in the safety of beautiful, albeit untested, hypotheses. We must throw the proverbial dice and see what happens. Data can be messy and uncooperative, but this is what makes research the most fulfilling form of play for scientists. Let us get our hands dirty and see what we get. The epilogue to this story is that key findings did not support some of our posited hypotheses, and yet we published the paper in a leading academic journal, wherein we explained why that was so. Do not be afraid to fail. Forge a path forward. Good things can happen when you try. They can even come from failure, attributing failure to the proper causes. Scientists, in particular psychologists, are well aware of the phenomenon known as the fundamental attribution error. It occurs when people misattribute causality in their daily lives. For example, people often attribute their successes to themselves. I did well on the exam because I'm smart, and their failures to someone else. I did poorly on the exam because the professor is an unfair imbecile. Depressives, interestingly, are one group that is less likely to engage in this sort of ego-protecting attribution of success and failure. The ability to learn beneficial lessons from a failure hinges on attributing failure to the right causes. Many entrepreneurs and small business owners are utterly impervious to their whenever confronted with a failing business, a failed pitch to venture capitalists, or a looming bankruptcy filing. They inevitably attribute blame to others. The culprits of their failures were the customers, who had no taste to appreciate their product offerings, the venture capitalists, who were too dumb to see their brilliant vision, or the creditors, who were perhaps too short-sighted, myopic, and impatient in seeking to collect their due debts. Entrepreneurs, by the very nature of their risky endeavors, need to be imbued with self-confidence. It is perhaps not surprising, then, that entrepreneurship is positively correlated with testosterone, a hormonal driver of risk-taking behavior. It takes endocrinological fortitude to partake in a startup venture when the failure rate of startups can be 90% depending on the industry. In other words, it is an inherent feature of the entrepreneur's reality that failure is the likely default value. Here is the description of the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford University. Fail faster will dive deeply into one of design thinking's key tenets. Fail early, fail often. Students will explore ways to 1. Become comfortable with uncertainty, 2. Develop tools to navigate situations of failure, and 3. Learn to turn failures into opportunities. This exercise-based workshop will examine the physiological impact of failure and practice the psychological traits and the power of resilience through hands-on activities. Participants will acquire techniques to help them navigate, bounce back, grow, and even flourish in the face of their failures. Failures can serve as valuable teachable moments, but only if we possess the humility to learn from our mistakes. Obstinate entrepreneurs who attribute all failures to external forces outside of their control are ignoring beneficial opportunities for self-growth. Implementing a successful weight loss journey, a lesson of discipline and grit. On a whim, I decided to run my first marathon in 1985. Prior to the event, I had attended a runner's convention where my body fat composition was calculated using two methods: skinfold measurements using a caliper, and a bioelectrical impedance analysis using the principle that electric currents flow differently across muscle and fat. I had 3% body fat content. Some listeners who follow me on social media might have seen some of the shirtless images that I have posted from that era, wherein the chiseled 8-pack abs were on full display. Up to that point in my life, early 20s, I had always been extremely thin, seldom exceeding 130 pounds. Upon completing that first Montreal Marathon, I had promised myself that I would attempt to complete one marathon a year, and would complete the Ironman triathlon by age 35. Well, I kept the promise in 1986 when I ran my second Montreal Marathon, so things were looking up. But then 1987 hit. I decided that I was not up for the punishment of another marathon, and in doing so, I set the grounds for a gargantuan weight gain over the next few decades. I hit many first milestones, including the first time over 150 pounds, the first time over 200 pounds, and the first time over 250 pounds. My heaviest recorded weight was 256 pounds. The weight gain was gradual, but largely unabated, albeit there were periods of sizable weight loss. For instance, I became a vegetarian between 1996 and 1999 and dropped to 172 pounds. Despite my repeated attempts to permanently shed the weight, I was always unsuccessful at keeping it off. During the COVID pandemic, though, I managed to finally succeed at this nearly impossible feat. in parts driven by the lockdown, which sharply curtailed my ability to indulge at my favorite restaurants. I have lost a total of 86 pounds. The scientific research is unequivocal regarding the small likelihood of long-term weight loss journeys, and yet I have been successful thus far. How did I do it? Well, in terms of the general plan, I try to eat between 500 and 700 calories per day, largely chicken and fish with some vegetables, and clock between 15 daily steps, a combination of walking outside, treadmill, elliptical, and stationary bike. It requires extraordinary discipline, persistence, and grit never to deviate from the caloric and exercise goals day in and day out. Of course, for all of us, there are days when you feel too tired after a long day at work to meet your exercise goals. Or perhaps it's your wife's birthday, and you'd like to have a piece of that alluring cake. And yet, at every moment, you face the choice: stick to your stated plan or violate it. If you make the correct choice on nearly every occasion for more than 1 year, you can wake up more than 80 pounds lighter. A successful weight loss journey necessitates patience. You cannot hope to lose a sizable chunk of weight and maintain the weight loss via crash starvation diets. Instead, the new regime must be internalized as part of your new default reality. Permanent behavioral changes must be instituted. Again, this requires discipline, persistence, and grit. In the past, whenever I hit a weight loss plateau, my commitment would falter because I thought I had done enough. Instead of thinking that way, I reframed a plateau as a win and used it as a motivational boost to keep going. While I am coding my current weight loss as a permanent victory, I am only too aware that it requires a daily commitment to make the optimal exercise and dietary choices, coupled with a weekly commitment to weigh myself. I'd like to briefly return to the 2 marathons, both of which I completed in respectable times of 4 hours, 7 minutes, 42 seconds, and 4 hours, 29 minutes, 36 seconds, respectively. To run a 26.2-mile race in less than 4.5 hours requires you to be in very good shape. But much more important, one must possess an implacable mindset that compels you forward. Once a runner hits the proverbial wall, usually around the 18 to 20 mile mark, his muscles have been depleted of energy, and he can experience a crushing fatigue, a sense of disorientation, and at times, severe muscle cramping. At this point, and I can speak from personal experience, every fiber of your body is telling you to stop the pain, to lie down, to quit. The only thing stopping you from doing so is your mind. You activate your grit, your perseverance, and your resilience, and you go on, one step at a time. In my first marathon, I did not hit the wall, but in my second, I hit it severely, with symptoms that were sudden and seemingly debilitating. Yet, I made it across the finish line. As with that marathon, so with life. Life can be tough and painful, but if we persist, our incremental steps forward can lead us to a personal victory. Even today, more than 35 years later, I regret that I never attempted an Ironman triathlon. Perhaps, though, it is never too late to try. Meeting my musical hero, a lesson of persistence. What is your favorite music genre? Mine is known as the Philly Sound. It is a subgenre of soul music that was a contemporary of Motown Soul, The Temptations, Marvin Gaye, The Supremes, Smokey Robinson, and Memphis Soul. Otis Redding, Isaac Hayes, Al Green, Sam and Dave. Artists that fall within the Philly Sound include the Delphonics, The Intruders, and Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. My all-time favorite group within this genre, though, is undoubtedly the Stylistics, who were fronted by Russell Tompkins Jr., with his astounding falsetto notes. Their music was seared in my brain as I grew up listening to their melodic and hauntingly soulful songs. Whenever I would drive the Ithaca-Montreal route, my alma mater, Cornell University, is in Ithaca, New York, I would repeatedly play the same compilation cassettes of the greatest Philly Sound artists. The young listeners might need to look up the term cassette. In 2001, I took a leave from my tenured professorship at Concordia University and joined the University of California at Irvine as a visiting associate professor for 2 years. I was now making a larger salary and decided that I was ready to explore the feasibility of pursuing a long-standing musical fantasy. How much would it cost me to invite the Stylistics to perform at a private concert? Bathing in self-delusional assuredness, I reached out to their management team and was quickly disabused of my plan. Apparently, professors, even business school professors, cannot afford the Stylistics. The plan lay dormant for another 15 or so years until I decided to try again. Using a new approach. Beginning in 2014, my YouTube show, The Sad Truth, had become hugely popular. What if I were to invite Mr. Tompkins for a chat on my show? I decided to explore this possibility and tried to contact his managers. To my disappointment, I did not hear back from anyone. Perhaps a year or so later, I was recounting the story to my young daughter, who must have been around 8 years old at the time, and she insisted that I write to them again. And so, I tepidly acquiesced to her nudge, but again did not hear from anyone. My daughter, who is a model of persistence, proceeded to then helm me about calling them, rather than sending an email. I was finally able to speak to one of Tompkins' managers, who assured me that he was happy to oblige my invitation. But perhaps in a few months after completing a tour, you can guess what happened next. My daughter kept pushing me to follow up, which I did by leaving a voicemail reminding his people of my earlier request to host him on my show. On an otherwise uneventful Saturday morning, as I sat watching a soccer match from the British Premier League, our landline phone rang. It almost never does. My daughter, perhaps sensing that this might be a momentous call, ran to get me the phone. As I looked at the caller ID, I could not believe my eyes. It took Herculean restraint to answer nonchalantly, "Hello." On the line, I heard, "Hi, this is Russell Tompkins Jr. May I please speak to Professor Sod?" Any semblance of calm and collected restraint went out the window when I said excitedly, "Oh my lord." We ended up scheduling a chat on my show, wherein, to my delight, he sang a few notes of my favorite stylistic song, "You Are Everything." Several months later, I was invited to participate in a panel at the Marketing Science Conference held that year in Philadelphia. Knowing that Russell lived in the city, I reached out to him and asked if he wanted to hang out. He kindly agreed to do so. While I am hardly one to be starstruck, I could not believe that the man whose voice was omnipresent at countless moments in my life was about to have dinner with me. Russell and I had an extraordinary evening together, sharing personal stories as two long-lost friends might do. His grace, humility, and kindness were truly awe-inspiring. After dinner, he offered to take me for a walking tour, which I gladly accepted. As we strolled the sidewalks, where famous musicians of Philadelphia were honored with plaques, including one for the Stylistics, he shared stories of his interactions with some of these legendary singers, and all along, people would come up to him and say hello, and recount how much his music meant to them. I recall thinking to myself, this needs to be documented. I should have videotaped the evening. Well, I hope that my telling this story serves as a historical record, of sorts. There are two important life lessons to glean from this magical friendship. The first is that to succeed at anything, you have to try. Or, to quote the great basketball player Michael Jordan, I've missed more than 9-0 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot. And missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed. Well, I decided to take a shot and reach out to Russell. I succeeded in forging a friendship with my childhood musical hero. The second important life lesson is to listen to your children. They are wiser than we give them credit for. Without my daughter's persistence, this story might have never taken place. On Joe Rogan's podcast, I once discussed two entertainment celebrities that I would love to host on my show, actor and director Clint Eastwood and composer Burt Bacharach. I grew up watching Eastwood's spaghetti western movies and later appreciating his non-woke positions, and listening to Bacharach's hauntingly beautiful melodies. Imagine my surprise when I received a private message from Bacharach's Instagram account. It was written by Bacharach's son. The son had seen me on the Rogan podcast and said he would try to set up a chat between his dad and yours truly. All it takes to make connections with people is to have a friendly, open spirit. Life can truly be beautiful. Get out there and seize the day. Baptism by fire is a form of anti-fragility. Most worthy endeavors in life, be it completing medical school, running a marathon, or starting a new business, require persistence and focus. The late basketball great Kobe Bryant coined the term Mamba mentality, which he explained as follows: hard work outweighs talent. Every time. Mamba mentality is about 4 a.m. workouts, doing more than the next guy, and then trusting in the work you've put in when it's time to perform. Without studying, preparation, and practice, you're leaving the outcome to fate. I don't do fate. Psychologist Angela Lee Duckworth has pioneered the study of the grit trait, which captures this form of stick-to-itiveness. While grit is correlated with various achievement outcomes, such as academic performance, it has a more general positive effect on happiness and well-being, and this holds true across widely disparate cultures. Part of possessing grit is the capacity to be resilient in overcoming obstacles as you seek to achieve your goals. While resilience is in part shaped by an individual's personality, some forms of childhood adversity foster resilience, which may result in beneficial outcomes. In the same way that one's immune system needs to be challenged during childhood for optimal functioning, overcoming psychological stressors is a key feature of peak functioning. You cannot lead a maximally enriching life if you are never challenged. Developing a proper response to life stressors is a central feature of resilience. I have experienced some of the worst imaginable childhood adversity growing up during the Lebanese Civil War, but those negative experiences have allowed me to develop great resilience in tackling the more mundane challenges of my life in Canada and the United States. Rigorous training in specific skills and in how to respond to challenging situations under stress is a part of many jobs, especially in the military. Pilots go through demanding flight training. Those who want to be Army Rangers or Navy SEALs are compelled to push their minds and bodies to the limit. But there are other occupations and professions that, metaphorically, have grown flabby and weak. That would include, I'm afraid, higher education and my academic colleagues. All those tepid hyper-specialists who are too afraid to utter one word that might offend academic superiors, militant feminists, the pronoun Taliban, or the woke mafia. Knowledge be damned. In the last few years, I have noticed that this weak mindset permeates all layers of academia, but especially when interviewing prospective hires for assistant professorships. When I was a doctoral student at Cornell University, young academics had their first big baptism by fire moment when they were invited, as part of a departmental speaker series, to give a lecture from their developing doctoral dissertation. This was a very intimidating platform from which to share one's research, because the audience did not suffer fools gladly, and professors prepared senior doctoral students for the eventual grilling they would face when seeking assistant professorships at elite universities. I faced additional anti-fragility obstacles as I made my way through to my PhD. Doctoral students at the Johnson Graduate School of Management, Cornell, had to pass the exam, which was made up of two parts. 1. Professors serving on a student's Ph.D. dissertation committee could ask questions about his specific areas of expertise, while many doctoral students had a supervisor and 2 additional committee members. My doctoral committee was composed of 4 outstanding scholars: Drs. J. Edward Russo, Douglas Stauman, Ollie Hattie, and Alberto Seger. 2. Once the doctoral student presented his dissertation proposal, the committee members would ask pointed questions about the prospective research. No question was out of bounds, as the student had to demonstrate complete mastery of his subject and his proposed dissertation research. As I presented my dissertation proposal on that fateful day, I noticed that my committee members were not exuding an aura of friendliness. The tone was set by my doctoral supervisor, who began the barrage of tough questions. As I fielded his first question, he took an indignant deep breath and retorted, "I'm going to ask the question a second time, hoping that maybe this time you'll understand it." And we were off. It came time for Professor Hattie, a world-renowned statistician, to ask his questions. He started off by saying, "I know that I told you that I would not ask you detailed technical statistical questions." Well, I lied. He then proceeded to ask me a very detailed technical question, which, because I was well prepared, I managed to answer. Once the professors had gone through several rounds of very probing and difficult questions, I was asked to step outside the room as they deliberated my fate. I asked my supervisor, should I stand by the door outside the room? He stared at me coldly and responded, "Stand far enough that you cannot hear us." As I stood outside the room, I felt somewhat frazzled. I thought I had answered all the questions properly, and I certainly knew my material. But based on the harsh tone of some of the questions, I felt quite nervous. After what seemed like an interminable wait, the door swung wide open and my doctoral supervisor walked toward me with a full smile. I was puzzled and a little unhappy and asked him what was going on. "Oh, this was some good old-fashioned Ivy League butt kicking," he said. "It will make a man out of you. We are trying to make sure that you can handle yourself when you go out on the campus visits." As I made my way back into the examination room, the other committee members were all smiling and congratulatory. The tense environment had dissipated into the usual warmth of their supportive mentorship. Once doctoral students defend their dissertation proposals, they send application packets to universities hoping to land a job. The first round of interviews is usually held at the annual academic conference of their discipline. In my case, as previously mentioned, I had around 25 scheduled interviews. The interviewers require that one present one's dissertation work in a cogent and succinct manner. In preparation for that eventuality, my doctoral supervisor had me prepare a one-page summary of my dissertation, which I excitedly agreed to do. He had me rewrite it several times, and in one instance, he feigned falling asleep before telling me, "Now go back and rewrite this so I don't fall asleep reading the first sentence." Throughout this process, I became deeply indebted to my great mentors for testing my resilience and mental toughness. They did not coddle me. They were not concerned with sparing my feelings. They did not give me a participation trophy for showing up. They expected great things of me, and accordingly they made sure to test my anti-fragility. For that, I am eternally grateful to them. Incidentally, I recently found out that my doctoral supervisor is retiring from Cornell. Several of his former doctoral students, including yours truly, joined him for a commemorative get-together. Expressing gratitude is not only polite, but also another component of a good and happy life. Life lessons stemming from a lost wedding ring. My wife and I have truly unique wedding rings. Our respective fingerprints are engraved on one another's rings, along with personal inscriptions. Beyond this, I revere my wedding ring, because it is a permanent reminder of the beautiful love that I share with my wife. The thought of losing the ring is unthinkable to me. And yet, this is precisely what happened in the summer of 2014. My family had spent the day having fun at my in-laws' chalet, located on the edge of a river with a fast-moving current, and at my brother-in-law's chalet, located on a beautiful lake with fresh, albeit dark water that is presumably quite deep. The drive back to Montreal took approximately 90 minutes. Before heading home, we picked up some coffees at the Starbucks, where I had spent innumerable days writing my first book. When I realized my ring was missing, the chances of finding it seemed infinitesimal, given that it could have fallen into the lake, or into the river, or somewhere in the woods. The easiest thing would have been to give up and accept that the ring was lost forever. My wife and I decided otherwise. We combed through our photos of the day to see if we could narrow the timeline of when the ring was lost. The first piece of good news was that we found a photo taken after I had last swum in the lake, and my ring was still on my hand. This was a gigantic victory. We then looked at pictures of when we were at the river. The river's current is such that it serves as a type of treadmill. You can swim at one spot for a while. This is precisely what I did in several video clips, one of which captured the exact front crawl stroke at which I lost my ring. We had identified the precise moment and location where I had lost my ring. But this was hardly a time to rejoice. The riverbed is littered with endless rocks and boulders, and the current is very strong. While we had greatly improved our odds of finding the lost ring, it remained a nearly impossible task. My wife and I agreed to drive back to her parents' chalet the next morning. Prior to doing so, I realized that we needed to answer a crucial hydraulic question. Namely, how would a ring of that weight and size behave in that current? Would it quickly sink to the bottom? Or would it be carried downstream by the current? And if so, how far downstream? I asked my wife to find a test ring that we might use in an experiment when we arrived at the river, and we proceeded on our way. Once we arrived at the precise river location, we tied the experimental ring to a string and began the experiment. To our relief, the ring rapidly sank at the spot that it was released. In other words, it was quite conceivable that my wedding ring was somewhere within a 5 by 5 feet square area, where I had been swimming against the current. Notwithstanding this good news, it was hardly reason to fully rejoice, as the likelihood of finding the ring in such a rocky riverbed was minimal. Thanks for watching. The maximal depth was around 5 to 6 feet. I wore a set of goggles and a pair of sticky water shoes that would allow me to anchor myself on the underwater rocks, and began the arduous process of intermittently diving to cover every possible nook and cranny of the stony riverbed. It must have been 20 minutes into the process when I saw a shiny light coming from a crevice between two rocks. The sunlight was reflecting on the ring. I dove to the bottom, and to my utter disbelief, I emerged out of the water with my wedding ring in my hand. There are many valuable life lessons that can be gleaned from the tale of the lost wedding ring. First, it is always a good idea to be hopeful and optimistic when tackling difficult challenges. Hope is truly an elixir of life that can help you through countless trials and tribulations. The likelihood of finding the ring was next to nothing, and yet my wife and I persisted doggedly in our belief that the problem was tractable. Second, a good marriage requires cooperative teamwork. My wife had the clever idea of going through our photos, and I suggested the hydraulic experiment. Our collective brain power was an asset. Third, the scientific method is an epistemological tool that can be used when navigating through life. Reason, logic, and evidence-based thinking are available for all sorts of everyday decisions. Had we not conducted the hydraulic experiment, we would not have been able to prune the search space to such a restricted area. You can think like a scientist in your daily life, even if you are not a professional scientist. Several years later, the ring yielded a second miracle. If I were Catholic, I might seek to get that ring blessed by a priest, for it seems to be protected by St. Anthony, the patron saint of lost objects. My wife had loaded the kids in the car and driven to pick me up from our local cafe. As I was about to enter the passenger side of the car, I heard a weird ping and wondered whether I had lost some change from my pocket. My daughter got out of the car and noticed my ring by the car on the pavement. She too had heard the ping and decided to check. Had we not heard the ping, we would have driven home, and perhaps have never been able to identify the location where it had fallen off my finger. I have since purchased a plastic contraption that I place on the ring to ensure that it does not fall off my finger. However, as I have lost a tremendous amount of weight over the past 18 months, and hence my fingers are thinner, I might need to find a new solution for the slippery ring. This leads me to the last of the life lessons as relating to this story. Namely, some personal objects carry quasi-sacred status because they are associated with such deep emotional and symbolic valence. My wedding ring's lost and found journey is a metaphor of the limitless love that I feel for my wife and children. They make me immeasurably happy. Many of the worthy pursuits in life involve risks, obstacles, rejections, and the ever-looming potential of failure. By adopting a mindset rooted in well-calibrated persistence, grit, and anti-fragility, we increase the chances of overcoming the barriers that stand in the way of finding purpose, meaning, and happiness in our lives. In many instances, people end up foregoing prospective opportunities because of the fear of failure. But evolution has endowed us with an emotion that might compel us forward and bust through that fear, a topic to which I turn in the next chapter.